Alright, how's it going? So this video is going to be for those with Namecheap domains that are seeking a DDNS solution. So DDNS, or dynamic DNS, is the practice of automatically remapping a domain to a dynamic IP every time it changes. So what we're going to be doing here is running our own self-contained DDNS script directly on the web server in question, completely for free, without relying on any DDNS service, software dependencies, or external machines, which is often the case with existing DDNS services. In this case, we're going to be achieving this by using Namecheap's API. However, this exact solution will work with any other domain name registrars that offers any sort of similar API. Alright, so here's a spec for Namecheap's API, and this is what's actually going to allow us to programmatically update our records. And I'll have this linked in the description in case you want to take a look at it yourself. The important things to note here basically is just going to be the API endpoint and the actual API parameters, both of which we're going to take a look at more in depth when we actually start writing the script. But first things first, in order to be able to actually use the script, you're going to need to enable dynamic DNS on each domain that you want to have access to. So go ahead and head to your dashboard or domain list and go to Advanced DNS. And once you're here, you're going to notice your normal records, all of your normal settings. Scroll down to Dynamic DNS and be sure to turn this on. Otherwise, the API is actually not going to work. And it will give you a Dynamic DNS password. This is actually going to be your API key. We're going to be using this once we get to the script. Be careful not to leak this. In my case, of course, I'm going to get rid of it once I'm done filming. But keep this strictly personal. For all intents and purposes, it will count as a password. And then last thing is switch from A records to A plus DDNS for each domain that you want to be able to dynamically update. So I'm going to go ahead here. These are my live domains. Just switch from A to A plus dynamic DNS. And for the sake of the video, I'm going to go ahead and add a third one just so you can see the actual IP changing demo. And I'll just go ahead and give this that for now. I'll go ahead and save. And essentially, that's all we need to do. Okay, so now we can actually start writing the script. So hop onto whatever machine you're going to be writing on. In this case, it is going to be my web server. That is one of the benefits, is you can actually run this on your web server. This is just going to be a simple shell script. So go ahead and use Nano or Vim or whatever text editor you want to do and create your script. In this case, I'm just going to call it ddns.sh. And so flow of this is going to be pretty simple. There's basically just some information we need to gather, and then we can take action. So basically what we need to know is what is the IP of this machine, what is the IP of the domain that we want to change. We're going to compare them. If they're the same, then we know that the domain is actually up to date since we want it to point to this machine. And if it's not the same, then we actually we're going to need to go ahead and call our API and rebind it to the IP of this machine. So we can go ahead and get started here. So we start, if you don't know, we start shell scripts with basically just hash bang /bin/bash just to indicate to the machine that this is a shell script. And we're going to go ahead and just set up some variables here. So we are going to need a domain. In this case, I have it set up just so there's going to be one subdomain or one domain running on this machine and then multiple subdomains for the main domain. In this case, I'm going to be running this on norbertsgambit.net. Go ahead and put in whatever domain that you are hosting on. And then we're going to need the API key. So go ahead and remember before that API key that you can grab from your Namecheap dashboard. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead and do API key just as a placeholder, but this is going to be your actual API key or the script's not going to work. And lastly, you're going to have your subdomains or your hosts. We're going to put this in a list. And for any subdomain that you actually want to change the domain for, you're going to include here. And your basically syntax for this is just going to be subdomain and then a dot, or just a complete empty string if there's no subdomain, right? So in this case, I'm going to do all the cases just so you can see. So for the case where we just want to change norbertsgambit.net, we're just going to have an empty string. And then for the case where we want to change www. We're going to put that in. And then for that one that I created for this, it's just going to be called demo. Right? Dot. Include the dots and the list, and you can include any or all or however many subdomains that you want. So now we're done that. Now we can go ahead and actually gather information and start writing the script. So first thing, you're going to need to be aware of the local machine, right? The local IP of this machine. So we're going to go ahead and save that in local IP, and there's a simple way you can get this. So we're going to go ahead and we're actually going to run a command. we're actually going to run a curl command to Amazon AWS check IP service, and it's going to return the actual IP that was used in the HTTP request, just so we know that we are using the actual real live internet-facing IP, just in case you have multiple interfaces. So we're going to go ahead and do a curl -s, and then this is going to be http://checkip.amazonaws.com. And then this is going to return to you your actual IP. And then I'm going to be including echoes. It's up to you if you want to do echoes just to keep track of what's going on in the script. And later on, we're actually going to use them for debugging the actual API. So we're just going to go ahead and echo local IP and then $local_IP. Okay, so now we have the local IP. Now we're going to want to basically get the IP for each applicable domain. And then you can't actually just use a normal dig or whatever, or NSLOOKUP, because that's actually going to grab cache information on the machine. We need to make sure that we are bypassing the cache, regardless of what's going on, and getting the actual live data, right? So there's certain ways to do it. I have it set up in this case where we're going to figure out the authoritative name server for each given host, and then given the authoritative name server, we're going to query that server directly without going through our own local cache. So we're going to go ahead and create a variable called authoritative name servers, just because there could be multiple. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to execute a command. This command is going to be a dig command. And for all the details, I'm not going to take the time explaining exactly what each flag and each parameter does, but feel free to ask in the comments or to just look at documentation if you do want to know. But I have it set up in a way that everything's basically just going to work out of the box. So we're going to do dig plus short, and then we are going to hand it the actual domain in question, right? This is a variable, ns pipe head dash and 1, which is just going to give us the very first one that's returned to us, just in case there's multiple. And then basically that's all you need to do. You're going to have the authoritative name server saved in that variable. And then again, just for debugging, we can go ahead and echo it back. Authoritative name server for, this is going to be for that domain. And then we can go ahead and plug it in. Right. So now that we're done that, now we're basically done gathering information. Now we can actually go into a loop and start performing logic and start doing the actual API calls, right? So we need to know, first of all, we're going to perform some sequence of steps for every single subdomain. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to loop. So we're going to do for host in hosts, right? So we're going to open up a string and we're going to do $, curly braces, and we're going to go into that hosts variable that we defined. And then we're just going to do square brackets at, just so we make sure the loop retrieves every single element of that list as its own element, so iteration works properly. And then we're going to open up our do, right? And then inside of this, I'm just going to echo a single empty line, just because this is going to run multiple times. We want some padding. And we're now going to do a couple of things. So first of all, we want to know whatever the resolved IP is. So we're going to do a DNS resolution. And we want the actual IP that each subdomain resolves into, right? So we're going to assign it to resolved IP equals and $. We're going to run a command, and this is going to be where we actually use that authoritative name server. So dig plus short, and then at basically just means get the record at a certain server, right? In this case, it's going to be at the authoritative name server. Name server is technically a singular. That's just the name of the variable. You can change it yourself. And then we are going to go ahead and do each individual subdomain, right? So in this case, there's going to be www.norbertsgambit or demo dot or nothing at all, right? No subdomain. So we're just going to combine those two variables in this loop so we get exactly what we want each iteration. So it's going to be $host, $domain, right? And that's going to do a live resolution, not in cache, and give us that resolved IP. And then we can go ahead and echo what we get back. So echo resolved IP for $domain or for $host $domain and then the actual dollar resolved IP, right? So if you go ahead and run this now, you're basically going to see all the information being gathered. And then in this case, you're going to see 3 different resolved IPs, right? And now that we have that, now we can move on to the actual API calls. So we're basically just going to need to ask a question, right? So if the resolved IP is equal to the local IP, because that's how we're actually going to know if the domain is basically pointing to the current web server or if our IP changed and now the records need to be updated, right? So we're going to go ahead first and say is resolved underscore IP equal to dollar local IP, right? So it's resolved IP for the respective subdomain equal to the local IP, and then semicolon then, right? So if they actually are equal, we know that this is up to date. So we don't need to call the API. This is the case it's going to trigger most of the time, right? If there's no change, you're going to get into this case. And then we can just go ahead and echo $host, $domain, records are up to date, right? And most of the time, all 3 of your subdomains are going to be in sync, but you never know what's going to happen, right? So we're going to go ahead and echo that specific domain is up to date. And then the else is where the actual heavy lifting is going to happen. So anytime your IP changes, something goes on, and your record does need to be updated, you're now going to end up in this else. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to echo $host, $domain, records are outdated, right? So how are we going to fix this? So we're going to go ahead and we're going to make an API call. And we're going to plug everything in. I'll show you how to do that. And we're going to get some response back. And then we're actually going to parse that response for errors. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to take the response, right, which we don't have yet. We're going to build the API call right now, equal to, and it's going to be some command, right? So it's going to be a curl command. Since it's an API, we're going to do -s. And now we're going to go ahead and we're going to grab that link from before. So this is what it's going to look like right when you paste it in. And again, I'm going to link to source code and to documentation in the description. Essentially, you're just going to have this really long query string, and we can go through and start subbing in our variables now. So the first one, host. Host is actually going to have a little spin to it. So for each one, it's basically just going to be $ and then the variable name. But host actually has those extra periods at the end. So we're essentially just going to need to get rid of those because this does not accept the periods. This is just like the raw subdomain. So we're just going to put host inside of curly braces, and then we're just going to do \\, just for that. And then we're going to move on to domain, which is just going to equal $domain, and password, same drill. Password's going to equal $API_key or whatever you called it. And then the only thing of question here is IP, right? So you can go ahead and enter your IP, and it will map it to that IP. But if you read the documentation, essentially IP is entirely optional. And if you exclude IP, what it's going to do is it's basically just going to map the record to the IP in the HTTP header, right? Whatever IP actually sent the HTTP request is going to be the IP that Namecheap maps it to. So in this case, because we're running the script on the server, that's exactly what we want. So it's just going to take care of that for us. It's going to be the correct IP because it's the IP that we're accessing the internet with. We don't need to worry about that, right? So that's all we need to do for the actual API call, right? So that's done, should be mapped already. And then we're just going to save whatever output we get back in response just for error messages so we can parse through that, right? So we're going to go ahead now and we're going to parse our errors. So the first variable we're going to come up with is error count equals, it's going to be a command. And we're basically going to start parsing through the contents of $response, right? And while I'm at it, up here for authoritative server, we just forgot a $sign. Now there's going to be 2 different things. There's going to be error count, and then there's going to be the actual errors. And it is going to be a grep for each one, and these are going to be quite painstaking. So I just went ahead and inserted it. Again, source code is going to be in the description, so you can go ahead and copy these. I'm not going to get into the details. Essentially, we just get back a very specific format of response, and we want access to the error count and the actual error if there is one. You're just going to basically need to deal with what Namecheap's API gives you just to get the information you want. So once we're done with that, we can go ahead and actually check for the errors that we just parsed. So we're going to go ahead, if statement, we're just going to ask a question. So we're going to go ahead and look at error count, and we're going to say, is the error count equal to 0, right? So did we get any errors? We'll open up the then. So if it's equal to 0, there's no errors. In the case that there's no errors, we know that the API was successful, the call was successful, and we successfully actually remapped our domain. So we're going to go ahead and just echo API call successful DNS propagation. May take a few minutes, right? We're going to talk about the difference between the API call and then the actual propagation in a bit. So don't worry about that yet. And then the else case here is going to be basically if we make an API call, but it actually fails, right? So we get back some failure, and then we're going to basically want to just display what the error message actually was. So in this case, we're going to say API call failed, and then we're going to give the reasoning with the $error, right? ERR, that's going to be the actual error. Could be something like an invalid API key, or you could actually go into like a host or a subdomain that doesn't exist. We'll give an example of that as well. And when we're done with that, we can close this up with the FI, and then the other else, we're going to need another FI, and then for the entire loop, we're going to need a done. And while I'm at it, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to run this afterwards. But let me real quick just go here, and I'm going to add in something just to show that error parsing. So I'm actually going to put in a, let me say, doesn't exist, right? And then we'll exit out of here, Control X to save in Nano, or Control X to exit, Y to save. It will ask you enter, just confirming your file name. And essentially that's all we're going to do. And then if you ls, you can go ahead and you can see that the script is actually there. So now I'm just going to run through some examples. So this is my live data here. So the @ which is no subdomain, and the www are mapped to the correct IP addresses, and the demo which we created is not. So we're going to expect to see that changed when we run the script. So to run, it's just going to be /DDNS.sh. And then if you get permission denied, it's probably just because you don't have execute permissions on the script. So just go ahead and do chmod +x to add execute permissions, and then DDNS, and then you should be good to go. So we're going to go ahead and run it. So /to run. And here we get some good output. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. So no subdomain matches the IP up to date, and www matches the domain up to date, right? So that's what we expect. Demo here, remember I put in the 127 address, which is indeed outdated, and we went ahead, made a successful API call. Propagation might take a few minutes. So this is live, so as we can see, that is 127. Let's go ahead and refresh here. Comes through as the correct IP, right? So that's a working API call. DNS checker will link this as well. You can basically check how long propagation takes. So right now we have 127, and it is still 127, right? Some servers are going to update. Still might take a couple minutes. The important thing is that it actually works with Namecheap, right? The API work with Namecheap. That's what you're looking for. That's going to be instant. And then this might take a while. We'll go ahead. Still 127. Could take a couple of minutes. But the important thing is that it did go through. Then lastly, I put in that doesn't exist subdomain on purpose just to see. I think I forgot a dot. But either way, the API call went through and then failed. And then this is us parsing out our reasoning, saying our record's not actually going to be found, right? Since we don't have an actual record, right? So that works. All right, so last thing is going to be to automate execution of the script, just so we can have it running on some regular time interval 24/7 without needing to kick it off manually. So to do that, we're just going to add it as a cron job. So we're going to go ahead and open up cron tab and then do -E to edit. Head to the bottom, and then it's going to be up to you what time interval you want to do. In this case, I'm just going to do 5 minutes. So I'm going to do */5 and fill in all the other time intervals with wildcards. And that's just going to be the command you want to execute. In this case, it's going to be /DDNS.sh, or whatever path and file name you gave it. This will actually work, but the last thing, though, is all of those echoes aren't actually going to be viewable. They're not going to go anywhere. So what we're going to do is we're just going to redirect those to some log file. You can choose to either do a single arrow, which is going to overwrite the log file every time the script runs, or a double arrow, which is going to append to it. In this case, I'm just going to do a single arrow just so you can see the very last output rather than cluttering up the log file. But it's up to you how you want to run things. And then I'm just going to go ahead and call this ddns.log. You can call it whatever you want, and it doesn't actually need to exist. It's going to go ahead and create it for you if it doesn't. And then just exit, save. We can see cron tab installing new cron tab. And we're good. We're not actually going to see the log file for 5 minutes, but when it does run for the first time, it will just run 24/7 every 5 minutes, and output will be viewable in ddns.log. So that's going to be it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed. Any questions or anything, just let me know in the comments, and I will get back to you. But apart from that, thanks for watching.